So we talked about what happens once we diagnose an FAD here in the US, that there will be at least a 72-hour standstill. And depending on the extent of the outbreak, feed may be involved in the standstill. So what would happen? If you've got pigs, and then no feed could be delivered during that time period. So you got several options. You can most obviously you're going to have to manage what feed you have available on site. You might be able to slow pig growth down, or you're going to have to find alternative sources of feed. So those are kind of the questions that are in front of you. So Dr. Nick Gabler, a nutritionist here at Iowa State, and his graduate student, Kayla Miller, took this on, which was to look at several different methods of extending feed that was already on the site if feed was included in a national standstill and no feed could be delivered. So they did a series of different options in one barn that looked at late finishing pigs that were placed. They were done looking at 1 of 5 treatments at 12 pens per treatment. It was a 3-week study that looked at 2 different periods. So the first period, or period 1, was run from day 0 to 14. That's when those treatments were put into place. So 14 days, that's pretty long. I don't think we'd ever see a standstill that long, but the idea was to test the upper limits of that. So that was the first period. Day 0 to 14, those 5 different treatments would be put into place. And then day 14 to 21 is the second period. After that, all pigs were fed full feed of the control diet. So no restrictions were put into place. Here are the different treatments that were looked at. There were 5 different strategies. So the first one were just control diets. So just how pigs are fed today, ad libitum, in other words, as much feed as they can eat. Continual access to feed the whole time. And ad libitum pigs, they'll eat about 3 times their normal maintenance energy requirement. Okay. Treatments 2 and 3 were actually looking at restricting the amount of feed that they got. So they were kind of restricted fed at the pen level at a 1.45 times maintenance energy requirement, and then a 2 times maintenance energy requirement. And those were simply done by calculation based on their size and their metabolic needs. And then they calculated the pounds of feed that were fed. And then those pigs were fed that amount of feed was put into the feeder, at one point in the morning. And then that's all those pigs got for the entire day until they were fed that amount again the next morning. Treatment number 4 was just leaving feed in the feeder all the time, but closing the feeders down to the absolute tightest setting. So the pigs would have to work really hard to get any feed out of that feeder. And then the 5th one was looking at an alternative strategy. Let's assume we can't get feed in from the feed mill, but maybe we've got a bin of corn, shelled corn on the site or close by, and we'll just feed them whole corn or shell corn. That was the 5th treatment. So here were some pictures of the different options. So the control diet there on the left, you can see that's just normal dry feeder there with probably about 40%, 50% pan coverage. On the upper right hand, you've got the closed feeder. So that's the feeder's full of feed, but we've just got the feeder adjustments down as absolutely tight as they can go. So there's probably only about 5 to 10% pan coverage there. And then down the lower right-hand corner, we've got ones that were fed the whole corn diet. So once again, about 20 to 30% pan coverage, but they were just fed whole corn. So data was collected on day 0, day 14, and day 21. So individual body weights and then pen feed intake so that we could calculate average daily gain, average daily feed intake, and feed efficiency. In addition to that, we wanted to know if the pigs were more aggressive. We wanted to look if there were any animal welfare aggression scores associated with some of these different treatments. So daily observations were made looking at tail bites, ear bites, side bites, sores, any other indication of aggression. Those were done daily. And then mortalities or removals were recorded as well. Okay, so this is looking at the period 1, so day 0 to day 14, looking at the 5 different treatments and their impact on feed intake, which would be the most logical one to look at because we're trying to restrict, the feed intake on these pigs compared to the control diet. So the bar there in gray, that's the control pigs. Everything there you see is in kilograms, so you got to roughly double that to get the idea in pounds per day. So you can see the second and the third one, the green and the blue bars there. Those are the restricted fed at the pen level. So that's just where they calculated the number of pounds that were fed. They put that in the feeder. When that feed was gone, that was gone for the rest of the day until the next morning. So you can see that did a pretty good job. The 1.45 times maintenance level, that restricted feed intake by about 56% or almost half the control diets. The ones that were fed at twice maintenance level, that reduced feed intake by about 41%. Just closing the feeders down, tightening them down to their tightest setting, that reduced feed intake by about 22%. Okay, and then feeding the corn diet, they could get as much corn as they want. That on a weight basis, that reduced the intake by about 25%. So that was day 0 to 14. Here's the entire graph. So you can see that was during the restriction period, day 14 to 21. Remember, they all got fed like the pigs in the gray bars got fed during day 0 to 14. So they were not restricted any longer. They were fed as much feed as they wanted to be fed. And you can see there's a little bit of, compensation for being restricted. They ate actually a little bit more than the control pigs did. And then day 0 to 21 average those two periods together. So this is the impact on average daily gain. So as we kind of expected, in the period 1, day 0 to 14, as we restrict intake, we're probably going to restrict the growth a little bit. We certainly saw that. And then in period 2, as they compensated for the restriction in day 14 to 21 by eating more feed, they actually grew faster than the control diets. And then, but if you average it overall, day 0 to 21 certainly gained less than the control pigs. Feed efficiency, you'd expect that was probably a little bit lower because we were restricting them in period 1. Period 2, obviously they were compensating by eating more, so they weren't converting feed quite as efficient. Overall, not a lot of difference between those time periods. If we look at the body weights by doing the restriction, we look at some differences by those. Probably the take homes there is the body weights at day 14, and the restricted ones were reduced by about 5 to 15% compared to controls. And then we knew from day 14 to 21, we had some compensation. Once they were fed, returned back to normal feeding. So from day 0 to 21, when you average all that up, the body weights were reduced by about 2 to 9%. Did do some carcass composition measurements to see how that feed intake restriction potentially would impact any carcass measurements. We see some differences there. Probably the ones to highlight is it looked like whole corn decreased the lean percentage in the loin depth. The restricted feeding reduced fat in the loin depth. And actually closing the feeders down, they actually, from a carcass standpoint, were pretty similar to the control diets. This is interesting looking at the behavioral scores. So on day 0, at that time, everybody been fed normally. There really wasn't much for aggression scores. And then you can see as we implemented the different restriction activities, we did see some aggression scores there from day 3, 7, 10 to 14 with the 2 pen restriction where they only fed metered out a certain amount of feed. At first thing in the morning and then not fed at all till the next morning. The green and the blue bars, they probably had the higher aggression scores till day 14. And then remember at day 15, they were from day 15 to 21, they were just fed back to normal. And you can see in that 7-day window, all those aggression scores all healed, resolved, they completely went back to normal. And no animals died or were removed during that time period removed at all. So really none of that aggression resulted in any animal suffering.